The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, James Schrempfer, and on this episode, I will be joined by Father Anthony Cekada of St. Gertrude the Great Catholic Church in Westchester, Ohio. Father, so glad you could join us this evening.
I'm always happy to wade into controversies, James.
As traditional Catholics, we never seem to run out of them.
That is for sure.
On this episode tonight, we're going to be discussing the controversy found in many traditional Catholic circles of Archbishop Lefebvre being consecrated by a supposed Mason, Cardinal Lignard.
Okay.
And this is based on an article you put together in 2003, and sad to say it's something I often run into here, at least in Minnesota, and I believe across the United States in general, particularly in the Home Alone group. This concept that Masonic bishops cannot validly ordain somebody. So perhaps to give us a little background on this, Father, how did you first come upon this, or where did you first come upon this idea? And,
I was a member of the Society of St. Pius X in the 1970s, and we began an apostolate in the United States. I was ordained in 1977. And there were some other SSPX priests, Father Kelly and Father Sanborn and Father Dolan, who had preceded me coming to the United States. Also Father Hector Bolduc, Father Gregory Post. And these priests were in the process of establishing Mass centers in different parts of the country. Up to that point, the Catholics who wanted to adhere to the traditional Catholic faith and wanted to go to the old Mass generally would have to find a retired diocesan priest or someone who was willing to make a break with his diocese or with his religious order in order to take care of the spiritual needs of people who rejected the changes. So there were a number of Mass centers, a fair amount of Mass centers actually run by priests like this. Also in the United States in those days, there were a number of, we could call them independent traditionalist publications. It was not so easy to get information around in those days as it is now. You had a number of small publications. There was the Remnant, there was Veritas, there was Patrick Henry Omler's newsletter Interdom. There was a publication that an outfit called the Orthodox Roman Catholic Movement put out. So there were all of these different small publications. As the society and priests of Archbishop Lefebvre started to work in the United States in different parts of it, there were certain writers and certain controversialists who did not really like what we were doing for one reason or another. Some maintained that, our apostolate was somehow illegitimate, and that, of course, would be the topic for a Home Alone show, because we didn't observe the supposedly the various points of canon law. Others didn't like the theology of different members of the Society of St. Pius X. So some of the lay people during that particular era, put forth the objection against Archbishop Lefebvre, against the validity of his priestly ordination and against the subsequent validity of his episcopal consecration. So they started to agitate against this on the basis of some documents, or actually only one document that we will talk about, and started to criticize or rather to say that the priests, Archbishop Lefebvre is not a real bishop, and so that those of us, his priests who had been ordained by him, were not real priests either. So that was something that started to be spread in the United States in the early days. The accusations of Masonry were made against Achille Cardinal Leonard. He was the Archbishop of Lille, which was the city where Archbishop Lefebvre was born and was ordained, and he was in fact one of the leading modernists at the Second Vatican Council. The antagonists, as it were, in the United States were a guy named Hugo Maria Kellner, who was a chemist. He lived in upstate New York. There is a publication in Kentucky called Veritas, and there was, of course, the, it seems, eternally living Hutton Gibson, who also promoted this particular idea. So they argued that since Masonry despised the church, those who were Masons among the clergy would naturally want to destroy the priesthood by withholding the required sacramental intention that they should have when conferring holy orders. So the idea was that all of these, any ordination that was performed, or consecration performed by a Mason, was automatically to be considered either invalid or doubtful. So that was the story. That was the beginning of the controversy, and that was actually the first that I had heard of it actually in the United States.
And it amazes me, Father, as someone that grew up even in the indult in the 90s, that was a common theme we heard around the kitchen table, so to speak, of, Cardinal Leonard is a Mason, Archbishop Lefebvre's orders are, questionable. And we don't even, I can't trace back a time, pinpoint a source of where it even came from. It just seems like I would say one of those myths that belongs in Catholic mythology that I don't know where it has a basis. So I guess,
we can talk about that a little bit, but it's sort of, a myth is right. It's sort of like alligators in the sewers, of New York City. So it's one of those urban legends.
Right.
The interesting thing is, though, that you point out that you've heard about it in your particular milieu in the traditionalist movement. In Europe, it is simply not an issue. I always found that very interesting. That he was a Mason, but so what? So that's the different reaction of American trads and continental trads. It's completely different.
Well, that's quite interesting perspective there. I didn't realize that this was only found in the America's Wild West, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right.
Where did this originate, Father? Where did this idea or this concept initially come up, or where's the source?
Okay, well, what happened is it kept on popping up. So in the early 1980s, we decided to get Dr. Rama Kumaraswamy. There's a mouthful of a name for you. He was a convert from Hinduism. His father actually was a great Hindu theologian, if you can conceive of such a thing. And Rama turned out to be a pretty good writer, so he said he would research the history of this. Well, the story supposedly came from a couple of places. We were told that, well, it was something Archbishop Lefebvre himself had admitted, that his ordaining and consecrating bishop was a Mason, that it appeared in an Italian publication called Chiesa Viva, a certain issue of that, and that it also was in a book by a French right-wing writer named the Marquis de la Franquerie. And it was found in his book, Pontifical Infallibility. So Rama investigated this a little bit, and what he discovered is that the article in Chiesa Viva was based on the story in the book by the Marquis de la Franquerie in Pontifical Infallibility. It was in text and then a little bit in a footnote. And that Lefebvre's admission or his comment about it was based on what he had seen in Chiesa Viva. So what happened is the story came from one source. It came from a writer, the French writer, the Marquis de la Franquerie. And he was a right-wing monarchist writer in France, and he had he had written an awful lot of stuff. He said in this book, Pontifical Infallibility, that the story was this, that Cardinal Leonard was a member of these Freemasonic lodges, and that he had been initiated in a lodge in Cambrai in France, and then the Franquerie talked about Leonard's supposed career. Now, what happens, though, is you look at this, and there's no source for it, except an anonymous man whom the Marquis de la Franquerie identifies as Monsieur B. He doesn't give us anything more than that, and says that, well, this guy was had received some sort of a papal honor. He was a papal chamberlain, something like that. So there's no source for the story. It's just these assertions that the Marquis de la Franquerie makes in his book. Well, the thing is that the Marquis de la Franquerie is not exactly, if you look at his other writings, he doesn't exactly inspire credibility, at least as far as I'm concerned. For instance, one of his ideas is that the kings of France actually were descendants of King David in the Old Testament and related to our Lord and the Blessed Virgin Mary. So that was one of the little theories that he sought to prove. The other, another theory that he had was that the certain members of the French aristocracy were actually part of one of the lost tribes of Israel, and so they could claim a ancient heritage via that. And the proof for it was a lot of them had big noses. So that showed that they were Jews and descended from the tribes of Israel. Okay, so then
Father, that's got to be solid.
Some of the stuff you say you can't make it up, right?
Oh, dear.
And the another thing is that he was a great believer in private revelation, sort of mystical futurist revelation. So that was another thing. And that you would have a great monarch who would come at the end of time from France, of course, one of these descendants of King David. Then another thing was that he ended up a great believer in this idea that Cardinal Siri was actually the real Pope, and this was the explanation for the situation in the Church. Now, the thing is that might be a good topic to cover sometime, but it shows the level of someone who's credulous, who'll believe and repeat, just about anything. So this guy was the I would say the equivalent of sort of a French Malachi Martin. And I never took seriously any of the other stuff that he wrote. And then, so the whole idea that one should rely on impugning on him to tell us that Cardinal Leonard was a Mason and that we should invalidate Lefebvre's orders based on that is quite a stretch, I would say. As they say, in Brooklyn, I've got a bridge to sell you. And this would be the bridge. Here in Cincinnati, it would be the Roebling Bridge, which was designed by the same guy who designed the Brooklyn Bridge. But that's another issue. So, in other words, you're not talking about a reliable source here for the factual assertion, okay?
And even there, this unreliable source is quoting an anonymous source to begin with. So you have uncertainty. So there's not much of a basis there. How about for the supposed deathbed confession, where Cardinal Leonard supposedly admitted to invalidating all these orders or destroying the church? There's many various quotes out there. Is there any basis for that particular?
Well, the thing is, I've never seen any basis for it. But if he's going to, my first question is, if he's going to do a deathbed confession, what is the confessor doing breaking the seal? So that's the first thing. The priest confessor is breaking the seal. And secondly, there's no way to verify anything like that. I mean, that's the equivalent of one of Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories. That it just happens to prove some sort of a crazy point. So there's no documentation for it.
Right, because as far as I know, I've never even heard the priest's name.
So it's maybe it was Mr. B's brother. Maybe it was Father B. So the whole, or I don't know, maybe it was one of the descendants of David or something, who was taking time off from being the future king of France. So the whole thing is ridiculous, and the idea, it just shows you how credulous really some trads are. To believe something like this on the basis of something that's undocumented, a secret witness in a book by a guy in France who's basically a crank. So
well,
it's scary.
Those unbelievers, those people that like to deal in the conspiracy world and just look for anything and everything. Let's just take the worst case scenario. Let's say, Cardinal Leonard was actually a Freemason. Does that, even if he was a Freemason, does that automatically question the orders that he confers? Okay.
So the thing is that what you have to do here is you have a theological question here that has 2 points. You want to find out, in the case of Leonard, must his conferrals of holy orders be automatically considered doubtful or invalid? Okay, so what you do is you make a theological argument, and that would to get to that point. First of all, there's a general principle that you have to see whether or not that's true. That if a bishop is a Mason, his sacramental intention has to be presumed doubtful. Okay, so that's the general principle you have to find out. We've already talked about the second thing, Achille Leonard, whether or not he was a Mason. So the thing is that you go to the general principle, and you have to see whether, in fact, this is verified by the teachings of Catholic theology. And the fact that the conclusion you clearly come up with is that it's not, and what's kind of at work here is what I would call sort of a lay type of understanding of theology, where people are kind of making principles up. So the key then is, if we assume he was a Mason, is the general principle true that whenever a bishop is a Mason, his sacramental intention must be presumed doubtful and all his ordinations presumed doubtful? So when you go to examine the case in terms of Catholic moral theology, Catholic sacramental theology, Catholic dogmatic theology, the first thing that you find out is a general principle that sacraments, when they're conferred by a Catholic minister, including holy orders, have to be presumed valid until invalidity is proven. And this will also come up, when we again return to the question of Archbishop Tuck's Episcopal consecrations. So the idea is that in sacramental theology, the way that it operates is that if you perform a sacramental act, the validity of it is always presumed until the contrary is proven.
Don't most lay people, even subconsciously realize this? Because when we look at few marriages are always presumed to be valid, even as a lay person. That's why you go to annulment court to see whether or not the invalidity has to be proven. Validity takes the presumption. That's something I always grew up with. It was just assumed.
Oh, yeah, sure. And the idea is that we're rational creatures and that our actions, that our mind is, what's in our head is presumed to be in conformity with our actions when we perform a certain action. So that's why, if that works for something like a sacrament, it also works, let's say, for a bad action. That the if you are accused of murdering someone, the idea is that you have you were seen with a gun and pointing the gun at the person. It's presumed that that's something that you intended to do. Right, because you have an external action, and that's how we normally operate as human beings. So it's a general principle.
The external action manifests the internal intention.
Yeah, sure, and that's for in general, and then in general in civil and church law, and in sacramental theology as well.
Because when we look at the questioning the validity of Archbishop Lefebvre's consecration, the only defect that one could even surmise would be the intention of the minister, because if there was any problem with the matter or the form, somebody right there at the ceremony, which was quite public, would have objected right there and then.
Sure. And that's how it works. That's what a master of ceremonies is for. That's what all the people around a bishop are for when he confers the sacrament. So you have him performing this or administering this sacrament with with matter and form, and when he does that with something like an ordination, he's automatically presumed to intend what the rite means. And the theologians all say that this is certain theological doctrine. So it's not something that you can blow off. This is, found in the moral and sacramental theology manuals.
And does this include, let's say, someone that is a heretic or schismatic even? Would this presumption still be included for someone of that nature?
And I think the answer to that is no. And if you just the presumption is there even for a heretic or an apostate or even for an unbeliever, because everyone has learned the principle of someone is dying, wants to become a Christian, and wants the sacrament of baptism. Okay. Say that he is one of these long-nosed Jews that the Marquis de la Franquerie is worried about, okay? But there's another Davidic long-nosed Jew there. And the first guy says to him, hey, come on, I want to be baptized. I always want to be a Christian. So here's what you do. You pour a little water on my head, and you say, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And so the second long-nosed guy says, okay, I will do this. The fact that the second guy is a devout Jew or a devout Mohammedan or whatever, then he doesn't have the faith, but he simply has the intention to perform this particular rite, and the first guy then is validly baptized and becomes a Christian. So that's a principle that we all learned. Okay, so
this Jew would not even need to believe in the effects of the sacrament.
No, not at all. And the reason for that underlying principle is this: that the sacraments our Lord instituted as means of salvation, and He wanted to keep the bar, as it were, as low as possible so we could get into heaven. So that's why there's only this minimum required when it comes to the confection of a sacrament. So even someone who doesn't have the faith, or who is a heretic or an apostate, it doesn't annul that, okay? Because the stuff in the intellect, adherence and understanding certain things and adhering to them in the intellect has nothing to do with an act of the will by which you're performing a certain action. Okay, so the thing is that it's just this a lower bar to make the reception of a sacrament, valid reception of the sacrament, ultimately as easy as possible, because they're intended for our salvation.
So how would an intention be defective?
Well, it would only be in a case where the minister of the sacrament makes an act of the will, say not to or do what the church does. So internally, he says, I intend not to do what the church does. Or he says, I intend not to ordain this particular person. So there's actually a case of that where a bishop in somewhere in Latin America in the 1700s, I believe, announced that, well, if anyone in the class of people he was going to ordain was of mixed Indian blood, he was withholding his intention to ordain from that person. Okay, so that would be an example. That would be an example of it. But even there, it's externally manifest. So, but he would have to make an act of the will, right? And when he makes the act of the will, he intends not to do what the church does, and not even to perform a sacred rite as regards that person, so that invalidates it.
So the key here would be this bishop in Latin America, he externally manifested his intention not to perform the act.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. But you can't have it, where theoretically where the bishop does not externally manifest that and goes through the ceremony. But there's never a presumption that happens. And that's what the Leonardists want to create. They want to create a presumption that, if you have someone who is a Mason, that his orders, his ordinations can't be valid. So but the invalid intention like this flips the general principle and on its head. And the rule that Cardinal Gaspari laid down in his fairly famous treatise on holy orders is that the minister is never presumed to have an intention of not ordaining someone. There's always he invokes the general principle that no one is presumed evil unless he is proven as such. As regards validity or invalidity, that has to be clearly demonstrated. So you can see that already when we get into the theology behind the Leonard issue, that the people who have fallen for this have turned the Catholic theological principle on its head.
Well, before we go on, I'd like to remind our listeners that they're listening to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, and I've been joined tonight by Father Anthony Cekada from St. Gertrude the Great Church in Westchester, Ohio, discussing the controversy of Archbishop Lefebvre being consecrated by Cardinal Lignard, supposedly a Freemason, and what are the sacramental principles that we have to follow. And we'd like to remind you that this is a production of the Restoration Radio Network, and all rights are reserved, and duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. Permission can be very easily obtained by writing to mail@truerestoration.org. So, Father, just to sum up a little bit there, presuming that someone had a faulty intention would be also presuming them to doing sacrilege, would it not?
Because it would obviously be a misuse of the sacred thing, and then it would be also sin of injustice. In several senses, a sin of injustice against the person being ordained, and another grave sin of injustice against the persons who would presume to benefit spiritually from the ministry of the priest who had been invalidly ordained. So, I mean, a very, very grave sin.
So for someone that believes this and just says, well, it's my opinion and I can hold my opinion, this does have repercussions insofar as how they are going to cause other people to view this person in the public. Whether he'd be dead or not, he's still entitled to a good name, is he not?
Sure. Indeed he is, and to say something like that, on the basis of which it has been said, is a grave injustice to those people who have been ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre. It's something that is obviously of a very, very grave charge.
And so these traditional Catholics that have come up with these theories, have they tried to research the theology, sacramental theology, or the principles behind this? Have they put anything forward, or are they completely going off the cuff from years and years ago?
Well, the thing is that I've read tons of sacramental theology. This is what I've teach, and I started actually doing some extensive reading into it because of in the 1980s because of the question of the Tuck consecrations, and I wanted to find out what all the theological principles behind that were. So one of the lies that Father Kelly spread about Tuck was that, Tuck withheld his intention at some point, in performing these consecrations. As with the Leonard thing, there's no factual basis for it. But since I am a fairly tenacious person, when I decided to research the Tuck consecrations, I thought I would research this question of sacramental intention and attention required for the conferral of the sacraments. And I didn't just pick up one book and look it up. I read my way through several libraries, through the moral and sacramental theology sections of several seminary and Catholic university libraries. And I also read my way through my own considerable collection of books and all is on this question of attention and intention in the conferral of the sacraments, in addition to the question of proofs, which the anti-Tuck people were beefing about. So, and never once did I see any theologian lay down the principle that, if you have a Masonic bishop, his sacraments are to be presumed invalid. No one said that. No one. And I've challenged these people who have come up with this stuff. I ran into one of the monks friars of Bishop Louis Vizelis. And in fact, the guy is a bishop, was consecrated a bishop by Vizelis, Giles Butler. So I ran into him in the airport, and I said, "Look, where is the theological proof for this?" That was sort of my conversation beginner. That can you give me a citation for it? You people have been saying this for years. I don't want your opinion. I want a page number in a theology book that tells me this. And of course, they can't come up with it.
Well, you must be well noted in public then for starting very light conversations.
Yeah, when people say, when I run into someone who has caused a little trouble, or has caused a lot of trouble, and who says things that are theologically and canonically stupid and things that have hurt people, I have no hesitation in letting them have it. So, or in trying to pin them down. And the thing is that if you make an assertion about some grand principle in theology, well, where is it? Where is it? So, so in all of these years, from the early 1970s right up till now, 2015, none of these clowns who have said that the Masonic bishop cannot validly ordain or is presumed not to validly ordain people, none of these clowns have come up with a reference to a recognized theological text. They've made it up.
And if we go back into history, Father, is there any sort of historical precedent we can also pull to look at this through? Similar to a court case, they always go back to preceding cases of similar nature and go, well, this is how the judge ruled in this case. Is there any case in the history of the church which is similar to what we are looking at in this hypothetical question that would give us some precedent to go on?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question, and you're right, it does give us a precedent. The Masonry in France historically was loaded with clergy in the 18th century, with Catholic clergy. And one writer, John Manners, said that in the year 1789, which is the year of the Revolution, 1/4 of the Masons in France were members of the clergy. Now, they had they had various reasons for belonging to Masonry, various misunderstandings about it, some of them, but some of them were in it for the bad stuff. The biggest example of a Mason was Talleyrand, and Talleyrand was a member of a noble family, and like a second son or something like that. He his father got him appointed to a position in the church. He became a bishop, and after he was a member of the Masonic lodges. He supported the French Revolution. We have the name of his lodge. We know where he belonged, etc. He helped the revolutionaries set up what was called the Constitutional Church in France. So Talleyrand and another guy named Goebel consecrated the first bishops for this Constitutional Church, which the leftist revolutionaries wanted to use to replace the Catholic Church and control. So to make a long story short, he did this in 1791. Eventually Napoleon came along, and 10 years later, he signed an agreement with the Pope to settle the question of what had happened to the church in France. And then the Pope appointed 13 of the bishops who had been consecrated by Talleyrand to head restored Catholic dioceses in France. So the Pope obviously had no problem with it. And in fact, one of the worst ones, the real classic case of this, was the Bishop of Strasbourg, in Alsace, right on the border. His name was Monsignor Saurin, Saurine. He was a member of the worst Masonic lodge in France. That was the Grand Orient. And people who know even a little bit about Masonry know how awful and how vile the Grand Orient is. In fact, he was one of the governing members of it. But nevertheless, the Pope appointed him when the Concordat was signed to be Bishop of Strasbourg.
So we had a Mason consecrated by a Mason that was appointed to an office in the church by Pope Pius VII.
Yeah. So the thing is that you can't say that there's a presumption then of invalidity, because if there had been, the Pope wouldn't have appointed the guy. And then the other thing that you have to look at is you say, okay, there are 13 of these bishops who were appointed, and who were consecrated by this Mason, and some of them were clergymen who also had Masonic connections themselves, that subsequently they ordained priests and they consecrated bishops. So if you accept the Leonardist principle that was being spread around in the United States, that would call into doubt the orders of the most of the clergy in France, because you don't know where it comes from. And if you want to go beyond that, if you want to say with a Mason you don't have a presumption of correct intention, well, I mean, that would also reduce to toast the baptisms that were performed by the lower clergy. Because if a Mason can't have a correct sacramental intention for holy orders, he can't have one for baptism either. So there are an awful lot of unbaptized babies and unordained priests in France. So once you get to the you start working out the consequences of this insane principle, that's what you end up with.
And when I was reading your article, Sacramental Intention in Masonic Bishop, which summarizes this in detail, I came across the name Cardinal Rampolla, and it's going back to my indult days, even as a younger teenager. I remember hearing, how he was a Mason, and the Emperor of Austria vetoed his election, and then we had Pope Pius X elected in his place, and the Emperor of Austria had vetoed it because he knew Cardinal Rampolla was a Freemason.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have a clear case of a cardinal as a Mason, or at least that's the story that I've gotten over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Did he consecrate anyone? Is there any historical precedent surrounding?
Well, here's actually the story. The reason that he was vetoed by Franz Joseph, the emperor, was not because of the Masonic connection, but because he had, as the Secretary of State, he had forbidden the ecclesiastical burial of a son of the emperor who had committed suicide. So there wasn't a direct Masonic connection there, but it is said that he was a member of the lodge at Einsiedeln in Switzerland. There's a pilgrimage place, very famous pilgrimage monastery in Switzerland, the Benedictine monastery of Einsiedeln. And there was a lodge across from the monastery that he was a member of. And, there was Masonic regalia supposedly that was found when he died, etc. So the thing is, though, that if you adopt the crazy principle of invalid Masonic orders, if there's a suspicion of someone being a Mason, well, in the case of Rampolla, it also makes toast out of a quarter of the bishops consecrated in the United States. Because when I was researching this article, I came across a table that was published of the bishops' lineages in the United States, and a quarter of them descended directly from Cardinal Rampolla. So, including a lot of very prominent American bishops. So, if you admit the principle, that's what you end up with. So it's a crazy thing once you get into it.
So it's historically we've definitely seen no evidence, or we've seen evidence quite to the contrary. Of this absurd principle of, well, he's a Mason, so therefore he must have had a faulty intention. We could definitely put this one into the storybook of Catholic mythology to read for bedtime fairy tales.
I think so, or campfire stories or something like that. It's as I say, the same level as the urban legends, as the alligators in the sewers. That this is one that we have to flush down the sewer as well, I'm afraid.
Well, Father, I think that pretty much covers what we wanted to go over tonight. Was there anything you wanted to add to this? Any other thoughts?
Well, yeah, I'd like to just make the general point about the issues that we face as traditional Catholics, that to resolve issues like this that seem to be a little difficult, the guiding star has to be principles that you actually find in Catholic theology. And it's not always necessarily easy to find out what those principles are, but that has to be our guiding star in terms of how we're supposed to think and how we're supposed to act. When it comes to something like this issue of supposed Masonic ordinations, when it comes to the question of the issue of the question of the Pope, the nature of the Church, all of these other things that as Catholics we're supposed to adhere to what the Church teaches, and we're supposed to make a good effort to find out what she does teach. And it's not doing that is one of the phenomena in the traditionalist movement that has led to a lot of disasters and an awful lot of tears. So it's a question of understanding where we should look to resolve these issues.
And Father, having come from the indult and went down many rabbit holes, just in my own experience, in reading your articles and other good authors' articles, there was always footnotes. There was always quotes from actual texts. Reference material one could go to verify and, check to see whether or not this was Catholic Church's principles. And, having gone through Home Alone material, you don't find those footnotes. You don't find the theological authors quoted in their articles. And would you agree that really to understand how to take the credibility of your author, you really have to check his footnotes, so to speak?
Yeah, there was one actually, Novus Ordo Cardinal, who was, I forget who it was, he was known as a scholar of some note, and he said his question all the time when someone made an assertion in an article was dove scritto, which is Italian for, well, where is it written? In other words, what's your source for this particular assertion? And that's always a good principle to follow, to look for to find out what the Church teaches and be guided there.
Well, I guess we either have that, Father, or we have the Mr. B or the Father B. Those reliable sources.
I guess so. Sometimes for a lot of people, that's a lot more fun, So the stories about those big noses and the Davidic kings of France and the great monarch and Bessari and everything. That's all kind of very exciting. But really, to preserve the faith, I think we have to look elsewhere.
Well, Father, I really appreciate your time tonight and going through this with us. Is there any news at St. Gertrude the Great Church you'd like to share with us at this time?
Well, let's see. We put up a very cute video of our kids doing the spring program, our kindergartners doing where is my little dog gone? So you can see that on the SGG website. I also put up a 10-minute video of our young organist here doing the famous Bach Cekada and fugue in D minor. So it's quite an accomplishment. It's a very difficult piece of music. Since I'm an organist myself, topics like that are rather near and dear to my heart. Ascension is tomorrow, and a week from Saturday, we have the Vigil of Pentecost, where we'll be doing confirmations and have I believe as well, baptism, and our liturgical season, where we have the more elaborate ceremonies that will end the Sunday after Corpus Christi with outdoor procession and with our first communicants. So please keep them in your prayers that they remain faithful to the graces they've received, they will have received in both confirmation and in the Eucharist.
We certainly will, Father. You enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks very much. God bless you all.
Thank you, Father. We'll talk to you again next month.
All right. Bye-bye.
If you have any questions for Father Cekada or feedback on this episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at mail@truerestoration.org, and we will pass along your questions or comments to Father Cekada. We would also take a moment to remind you that all correspondence with us is strictly confidential. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and your faith, that you please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even simply an Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am James Schroepfer. May God bless This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.